Welcome to the TherapistsConnect podcast. Dr. Peter Blundell interviews therapists about their work and experiences within the therapist community.
Hello and welcome to the second series of the TherapistsConnect podcast. My name is Dr. Peter Blundell, and in this episode I'm delighted to be interviewing my good friend Susan Cousins. Susan works for the University Secretary's Office. Her role is Senior Compliance Advisor for Race, Religion and Belief at Cardiff University. She's a counsellor and therapist, as well as an author, and has written a book called Overcoming Everyday Racism, which is doing extremely well. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome her to this episode of the TherapistsConnect podcast. Well, first of all, thank you very much for doing the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I suppose we should crack on with some questions. For my first question, which obviously I've asked everybody who's done the podcast so far, is kind of what made you want to be a therapist? Kind of what drew you into this profession in the first place?
Well, the thing is, I guess, Peter, you've asked everybody that question because it's a really good question, and it really makes people think. And I thought about that question. And I thought it's actually quite a tough question. I guess a lot of people go into counselling, as I did, because I was referred to counselling by my GP. And my first session left me with a kind of overwhelming feeling of hope. And leaving that session, that I felt that change was really going to be possible. And I no longer kind of needed to be held hostage to my past. I felt there was some hope out there for me and a healthier, better future. And I remember just in one session, the words just gushed out of me at such high speed, and my counsellor just didn't say anything at all. And at the end of the session, when I'd just been talking the whole time at her, I said to her, well, I don't really understand why I've not allowed you to say anything and why you haven't said anything. And she turned around and she said to me, because you've got a lot to say and no one's been listening to you for a very long time. And those two things were absolutely quite profound to me. I did have a lot to say. I come from a very large family and I wasn't actually listened to a lot. And I did have a lot to say. So her answer was just incredible for me. It was profound to me. And it left a very strong impression. And I also thought, so listening to somebody and being present with another person and try to make sense of their thoughts and their feelings has such a healing capacity. And it just became something I really, really wanted to learn how to do. And that kind of experience of validation and that kind of empathy was a powerful experience that never really left me. And it was after that first counselling session that I decided that's what I wanted to do. And I went on to have a year of counselling provided by the NHS in those days. And my recovery was slow, and it took many years to kind of shift a lot of feelings of shame and loss and aloneness and a kind of survivalist mentality that I had into a kind of healthier person. And it was just an exceptional encounter. And there was something even more strange about that encounter was that I realised, as we slowly got to know each other, that she actually knew my mother. And that they shared a close friend and had met my mother on several occasions. Well, my mother didn't live anywhere near each other. This was in Bristol, and I was brought up in the Midlands. So that connection was really, really strange. But one thing I wanted to say about, and that is why I wanted to do counselling, but one of the things I wanted to say about that, Peter, was that race was never ever mentioned in that session.
How did you feel about that then, that it wasn't even acknowledged or spoken about?
Well, I didn't want to bring it there. I didn't want to bring it to the session. I felt like I was learning so much, and it was having such a profound impact on my mental health, and that my well-being was improving. My world was opening out before me. I didn't need that. So I didn't feel, I think I do, as I do with most people, unless I know them very well, and even when I know them very well, race isn't a subject that I tend to go anywhere near.
Mm.
So it was okay. It was okay.
And obviously kind of race and prejudice and everything is something that you talk about a lot now, given your what you do with the university and the book that you've written. And I know recently you did a BBC interview, didn't you, where you talked quite openly and honestly about your own background. You were talking about being adopted from a Mumbai orphanage by white British parents. And I was just wondering about those experiences of being transnationally adopted and growing up in a multiracial family. How did that impact on your identity then as a therapist?
Well, that had a massive impact on me. And I, as a kind of BAME person adopted by white parents, I don't remember a time that I didn't know that I was adopted. And I kind of always felt as if there were two parts of me, one left in Mumbai and the one I have with me now. And I don't know which bit belongs to me or to my Indian heritage. It's kind of like, feel like a broken vase glued together. It's kind of, I'm still the sum of both its parts. And yet the glue that holds it together appears to make it fit perfectly. But the glue's always separating those two parts. So I don't think I'm ever going to be strong as I would have been originally. I feel sort of kind of quite broken by that. I feel sad at the loss of language and my culture and my family. But I also feel on the other part of me, glad to have grown into the person that I am now and to have had the kind of experience that I had within my quite extraordinary family, of 7 brothers and sisters from different backgrounds. And James Baldwin said, made a statement, know where you come from. And I do know where I come from. And where the feeling of knowing where I come from has kept my feet firmly on the ground, particularly in relation to expectations of life. And I don't think I have a Western expectation of life in the sense that I don't think a day's gone by where I haven't thought about the death and of the children, that death in general, and of the children who were left behind in that orphanage and how some of them probably didn't survive and that I did. And it's given me a different worldview on existence and the fragility of life. And life is something I've never been able to take for granted or kind of to relax into. And this is sad, Pete. I've lost 5 members of my family. I lost my younger brother who died in front of me when I was very young in a very traumatic accident. I lost a brother in a house fire, and my sister was 19th person in the UK to die of swine flu. And where my family had to make the decision to turn off the ventilator. And I was with both my parents when they died. So given the family history and the low mortality rate, I kind of wake up in the morning and I'm always amazed that I'm still here. And I never really expected to live this long. I know that sounds really strange, but when you've lost so many members of your family, and I don't think that's accidental. I think the whole process of transnational adoption, I think, care system in itself, and I think it reduces life expectancy. But I don't know if there's been any research done on that. So, I was brought up in this kind of incredibly diverse family, brothers and sisters, Black, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, mixed race, mixed heritage. And we were all brought up from the age of 2. And I think that it kind of gave me, it was just very powerfully useful because I can identify with lots of different people from different backgrounds. It's like I've been blessed with a kind of flexibility with working across cultures because this is how I was brought up. And I was determined to offer BAME people access to counselling because there was real kind of inequality and still is in the provision of therapy for BAME people. And it's almost as if people could easily identify with my background because they thought that I was their background. So I've been mistakenly thought of as African Caribbean. I've been mistakenly thought of as South American. So I've been mistakenly thought of as many different things. So when the BAME person sitting in front of me, they sort of think that I'm same as their background, which has been just incredibly useful. So yeah, it's offered me, my background's offered me enormous amount of flexibility in the way that I work.
and being able to see life from kind of a multitude of perspectives as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A multitude of perspectives and experiences, and even to the extent that one of my brothers, in fact, one of my brothers who died, lost his life in the fire, was, you could almost think he looked Italian. So his perspective was very, very different from mine. And I was the darkest in the family, and talk about shadism within the family. I had a pretty tough time, because I was the darkest. But that's a whole other area of conversation.
Yeah. I really appreciate it as well, I think, in your BBC interview where you were kind of talking about how that there was a panorama programme, wasn't there, when you were younger, and kind of interviewed the family and how it had presented this kind of quite dynamic family and how multicultural and how well you were all doing, and that although it was all of those things, you talked about how actually the reality behind all of that was much more complicated and much more nuanced than maybe what that programme had put across. Well,
yeah, I mean the programme put it across as this wonderfully happy, functioning family, which of course, how could it possibly be? How could you possibly take these children from orphanages in different parts of the world and bring them together into a whole new unit, into the town that I was brought up in was mostly white. There was only one other black family, and it was it was on the one hand amazing and wonderful, and on the other hand something that's taken me all my life to work through. I'm still still the impact of that is affecting my life and who I am, as it's bound to have done. It was extremely traumatic. It wasn't, I wasn't brought up in this wonderful, loving family that was presented on that programme. And my parents did actually try to challenge that, to be honest. But I think that, it's kind of like, where would you want to go to in a programme like that for the sake of my brothers and sisters, and to protect my brothers and sisters? I don't think it would have been very useful for the family to have gone into it in any real depth.
Yeah. Particularly, I suppose, at that time period as well, really, where they were maybe using that programme to kind of try and show positive aspects.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it was that time period, and it was very much kind of the time period when people were being kind of exoticized in ways. It was the Grace Jones and Michael Jackson, Tamla Motown, and obviously there was all the politics as well. But within the UK, it was very much a kind of form of exoticization of BAME people. And I use the term BAME, and I apologise for it, but I'm not sure about the term people of colour, because there are people who are not of colour, who are mixed race, mixed heritage, who don't visibly look of colour. So, like everybody else, I'm struggling with categorisation and terminology. So, just thought I'd better say that, Peter, actually.
Yeah. No. I appreciate that. What kind of moving kind of away from your family history then, and maybe thinking about your kind of training as a therapist, what was your experience like as a BAME person, and how did you kind of approach your course and your training when you qualified?
Well, I really didn't want the course to frame me or to contain me. I knew that it would be a very white space. And it would be a Eurocentric curriculum that I didn't want, and I didn't want to engage in. Not only for my kind of own self-development, but for the client group that I was kind of determined to work alongside once qualified. And I was certain before I started the course that it wasn't going to help me understand or explore BAME clients' lived experience. Challenging people about race is incredibly difficult to carry out, and it's kind of full of pitfalls, barriers and obstacles. And I didn't want to bring race into my course, because I was the only BAME counsellor training there. And so it was incredibly difficult. So I left, as I did in the counselling session, I left race out of it completely, but I made the decision to write every single essay, even if it was about Freud or Jung or about integrative therapy or whatever we were learning in that time. And I can't remember, it was quite a long time ago, 25 years ago. I wrote it about race, every single essay. So I bought books that weren't recommended reading. I kept getting much lower grades, and my tutors kept saying to me, Susan, you're not scoring, you haven't reached the 10-point criteria. And I said, well, I'm not interested in reaching the 10-point criteria. I'm happy to get 6 points as long as I pass, because I want to do the reading that I want to do. I don't want to do your reading. I don't want to read all your books. I want to read the books that I've got about the same subjects. So I made a really conscious decision. And the reason I was able to write the book that I've written was because I've got so many books from that course that fed into the book and informed me about the overcoming everyday racism. So I felt extremely isolated on the course. It was kind of like some counselling courses that they were then very rigid structures, but the edges of it were quite soft. The tone of voice that's kind of ultimately sometimes excluding and controlling. And I didn't find it safe. I knew I wasn't going to fit. So I knew the course would fail to take into account, social, political, environmental structures, and it project blame onto my individual experience, which is why I didn't feel safe talking about my individual experience. And at some point I thought I would be called out and to take personal responsibility, because in those days, Peter, there was this thing about that almost BAME people were behaving like victims. And so when they were being attacked, it was because they looked like a victim or walked like a victim. And I remember literally trying to walk differently down the road. And I sort of thought, oh, it must be me. I'm not walking like I'm assertive enough. And I thought, and I really took this on board. And I sort of tried walking differently. I thought it would stop people spitting at me or shouting at me or abusing at me in the street. And of course that wasn't the case. So that was a very damaging view, and sort of loose and lazy thinking that was ignoring the complexity of the situation. So I'm kind of, I'm wary. I'm wary of that kind of thinking. I'm very wary of it. And
that almost blaming not almost blaming the individual rather than actually looking at the oppression in society and the views of others really that exist.
Well, exactly. It was all about the individual at that time. 25 years ago, it was about the individual. It didn't take into account institutional racism. People weren't thinking about changing the curriculum or challenging the curriculum or oppressive practice or anything like that. And, and I had a very strange event that happened, was that the sort of diversity training day came about towards the end of the course. And I went to my tutors and said, I don't want to attend this course. And they said to me, well, why, Susan? Why? You must come along. And I said, well, I don't want to go because I know I'm going to hear a group of white people who I've built up a relationship with, who I like and I'm close to, talk about racism in ways that I'm going to find emotionally upsetting. I just don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear denial. I don't want to hear people kind of overreact to normal everyday experiences of racism. I don't want to hear that kind of white response to racism in a room full of people where I'm the only person. And my tutors said, well, you must come, Susan, because, it would be really good to have you there and it will really improve the conversation. It will empower the conversation. And, you're such a good talker, Susan, it'll be able to really help people. So I went along and I ended up after 2 or 3 hours of putting up with all sorts of nonsense, walking out in tears. Because I was hearing all the things that, I didn't want to hear. I didn't want to hear people challenging that racism even existed. I didn't want to hear oh, we really need some evidence that racism exists. I didn't want to hear that kind of denial. I didn't want to have the projection. I just didn't want to hear it. And, the lesson I learned from that was to trust my instincts.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have gone in the first place.
And that's oppression in itself, isn't it? Is kind of using other people's experience to educate others, whether they wanted it used or not.
Well, exactly, Peter. It is. And I think there's another really good example of that. I don't know if you've heard of that, the privilege walk.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
I just, there's a film of it on YouTube. And if you look at the faces of the young black people in that YouTube video, the people that are left behind, it's just like, white people learning on the emotional, and being an emotional burden to the people who've been involved in that training. And I've done that training myself quite recently, and I've just thought, I don't want to do this. And it's just been horrific for the white people who've learned on the back of the emotional upset of the black people in the room, including my own, even recently when I did it. I don't know your thoughts on that, Peter.
Well, I mean, it's not something that I've ever used in my own teaching, but I am thinking about counselling courses in general, really, and how much personal material just in general is used from different people, and the balances of that, really, of people being comfortable enough to share and choosing to, versus people feeling forced to share, and the kind of balances of that, really. And I really appreciate what you're saying there in terms of, everyone needs to be able to have the choice about what they want to talk about, and it's not individuals' responsibility to be educating the group, is it? It's the group's responsibility to educate itself.
It is. And I think a lot of BAME people, black people, people of colour at the moment are talking about that. That sense of burden and responsibility that falls on them.
Yeah. How would you describe your approach and your to therapy now? Is it what were you trained in, and has it changed over time?
I think I did the integrative route, went down the integrative route, but I think I've always my heart's with the person-centered sort of multicultural approach. And I that's held me. And I suppose we could put into the mix there some existential stuff around making meaning out of everyday life, because that's actually something I find fascinating about the creative possibilities that exist in the space of a day and in people's lives. And I think that's also, particularly now under lockdown. Well, not under lockdown, but we are a little bit more under lockdown in Wales, Peter. But not being released quite as much. But that's really kind of put into focus, isn't it? That kind of what is the meaning of our everyday life? And I've always found that a fascinating place in which to work with people, rather than necessarily working with depression or anxiety. Of course, I've worked with those things. I've been working for a long time, or supervising people around those issues. I think that what is contained within a day and how one uses one's day and what is in that day has been something that's it's not really an approach to working, is it? But it's something that I'm always considering in the back of my mind. So obviously the past is important and the future is important, but the here and now has always been very important in my work. And a lot of the work that I've done, I has been working with victims of violence and race hate crime. So I've worked with people's behaviours. I've worked in a CBT way in terms of supporting people and increasing their confidence in entering public spaces if they've been attacked in public spaces, and working through thoughts and feelings. And I remember I developed kind of mantras like with people who've been attacked or assaulted because of their race, saying, because the street becomes a place of, harm. And I kind of said to people, look, these pavements are just as much yours as they are everybody else's. Claim the pavements for yourself. And particularly when working with young black men who feel that, as people walk towards them, that they're a threat just by, it's a marker of threat just by being black and walking along the pavement and having people walk away from you and clutch their handbags and all those kinds of things. The street becomes a place where you've got to reclaim that for yourself, to be brave enough to walk it. So I've kind of, I've had my relationship with CBT and the more mechanistic approaches like everybody else, and who comes from a different approach, from a humanistic approach. And I've learned that it's been incredibly useful. And I guess I wouldn't introduce anything like that with a client if I hadn't discussed it with them. I've had some brilliant supervision, and people have said, with CBT supervisors, saying to me, have you thought about this, Susan? And, worked completely outside my comfort zone.
Yeah.
But also kind of really like the whole notion of acceptance, and that, working with people who've been attacked or been abused because of their race, I kind of, talked a lot about accepting certain levels of anxiety and hypervigilance. And I feel like that myself. I've been physically assaulted as a child and several times as an adult. And I know that I'm never going to feel safe, and kind of that's okay for me. I've adapted, I've changed my behaviour. I don't feel I've got to live up to the expectations of others to be different or to somehow get over that, or to be stronger, or to be stronger against the whole society. That's kind of rich, really, isn't it? I know. So I've got all sorts of protective things around me. And I think it's okay to be like that. So I guess I work in many, many different ways with people, but I'm grounded in person-centered and a multicultural perspective.
That runs like as a thread through all of the work that you do.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So that's kind of like how your approach and your therapeutic work. And I know obviously you do a lot of talking now around racism and prejudice, and you've got your book out. But what was your early career like as a counsellor and a therapist? Can you tell us about some of the other roles that you've had over your career?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. That's a good question. My first job was like 1 hour or 2 hours working for Bernardo's Multicultural Resource Centre with BAME women. I delivered some self-esteem workshops. That was literally my first job, was running self-esteem workshops for BAME women, and I was I just loved it. And then through that, I got some work working with some BAME clients who were actually really on the severe end of having severe mental health problems. It actually wasn't particularly appropriate, but those people still come up to me today and thank me in the street, because I live quite near this resource centre. And so, I couldn't have done such a bad job as a newly qualified person with people with severe difficulties. But so that was my first job. And then I was the very first black counsellor to be employed by the then South Avon Health Authority. And I was, dealing with the traumatic experiences of racism in people's lives, being physically attacked, negotiating white workspaces, managing college, university, identity, being possibly over-medicalised, all sorts of things. And it's like, that was, it was tough. Those years were really tough. I felt like I was very alone. I never had a BAME supervisor. I didn't really have anybody to talk to about how different it was. The people that I was working with, the context in which I was working in. And, there was one experience that I had, because all the people that I worked with in this, I don't know what to call it. It was called Indicare, actually. We worked for 9 general practices. They were all white. And I remember I was working with this woman who'd been assaulted, and she rang me up and she wants to know how to get to the health centre. Go down there, and I was giving her a really detailed description of how to get to the health centre. Now, and then a white practitioner said to me, in the middle of this conversation, said, "You're disempowering your client." I sort of put my hand out in front of her to stop her talking to me. I never ever thought I would be able to get her to come to the counselling room, and never be able to get her to come to the health centre. So I was trying to do everything I possibly could to reassure her, and and I suppose that's the kind of thing. That was when we didn't have the language then. I didn't have the language to actually. I didn't know what to say to this person. This other practitioner had said this to me. It was outrageous. So I think I can't remember what I said to her, but that really stuck in my mind as, what it's like sometimes to be a BAME therapist working in an all-white service. Mm-hmm. I think there's definitely a role for white allies. But it's kind of like, it can't be kind of slacktivism. It can't be performative. It's got to actually there has to be action. And you can tell it's performative when there's silence and when people they're not upstanding, when there's denial or lack of acceptance, or the power just gets taken away from you in an unexpected fashion in a meeting or something. I mean, there are so many ways in which white allies can make a difference, and the structures that are in place. So I guess that white allies need to think about curriculum change, need to think about mentoring, need to think about supervision, BAME supervision if people want it. It's about choice, isn't it? And think about maybe across. If I was running a course, I might set up different courses usually, don't you, in different year groups, and setting up a BAME support group within that. I think there are just many things, and input into curriculum change, all sorts of stuff really. But I imagine you've thought of actually, Peter. Yeah, so there needs to be some resource behind this, because that is definitely affecting the amount of BAME people that go on courses, that simply having the money and the time, and it's I don't need to say it because everybody knows that, but I was involved in a project many years ago, which was about raising some money to support people from the community coming to do counselling courses. So I think those kind of things are really good ideas. I know it's difficult, but having a BAME supervisor is such a hard thing to find, a BAME supervisor, if you're going through training. I don't know. I guess with all the stuff around Zoom and everything, it's more possible to do that because you don't have to necessarily work with people in your own town. Recently I've had conversations with BAME people just saying that they'd wish that when that thing happened in that meeting, that white people, didn't act as bystanders and challenged it. And I think that's where a lot of BAME people get hurt. Because it just takes you back, it takes you by surprise, and you think, oh, hang on, I've been working with this person for years, and I thought they were, and they just didn't stand up to me. They didn't even notice it, or they did notice it, or they said they didn't notice it. Yeah. And that's where I think, to me, white allyship has got an incredibly important role in the here and the now of the way race interacts in white spaces.
And that's, as we talked about before, it's not that performative allyship. It's kind of actively challenging and calling out racism and prejudice when it's seen and heard.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do.
No, but it's something that needs to be done, and it needs an active participation in that rather than a passive observance of it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We kind of come to the end of questions that I had, really. But one of the things I did want to ask you about before we kind of finish was, obviously you've got your book out at the moment, Overcoming Everyday Racism, which I hear is doing very well. But I wonder what else have you got planned for the future? Have you got any other projects or maybe another book that you're potentially working on at the moment?
Well, I think, at the moment, so I'm kind of like everybody else. I'm really kind of worried about the future of the world. I'm worried about the impact of the self-inflicted global warming, and on an individual level, I'm kind of worried about my own mortality. And it's interesting that we talked about a lot about death at the beginning, and people are being faced with that at the moment, and I'm going back to that kind of everydayness of life. I don't really feel like making plans at the moment. I think I suppose the only plans I've got is I want to be near my children. I want to stay safe. I want to be healthy. I'm grateful for my life at the moment. I'm kind of I just want to stay with what I have.
Yeah.
I don't want to move too fast into anything else because, you know me a little bit now, Peter, and I know that I might get some crazy idea to start doing this and start doing that. And I have I'm somebody who kind of is really annoying. I wake up in the morning with a lot of energy and a lot of ideas. So I'm just trying to calm that down inside of me at the moment because life feels fragile, but it also feels incredibly precious. I don't know, how are you feeling about all that, Peter?
Well, I was just, as you were talking then, I was thinking about, in a similar way, how I can be very active, full of ideas, lots of energy and lots of things going on. But actually, sometimes it's just really important to be present in the moment and appreciate kind of what's around you and what you've got rather than where you're going. And I think, it just made me reflect on that really and think when we're looking at this whole idea of lockdown and what's happened over the last few months, it's probably given a lot of us more opportunity to kind of reflect on our own lives in a maybe a bit more of a deeper way than we have done before. Yeah,
exactly. And so I'm going to sort of say that I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think that's called watch this space.
Watch this space. You caught me out there, Peter. But thank you ever so much, because I've really, sorry I talked over you then, but thank you ever so much. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh no, thank you very much for your time, and it's been lovely to speak to you and find out a bit more about you, and I wish you every luck for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the TherapistsConnect podcast. Go to www.therapist-connect.com for more discussions and debates.